Picture a container ship the length of 4 football fields gliding through a narrow ribbon of desert at dawn. The water is still. The sand is quiet. But what is happening here is anything but peaceful, because this 120-mile ditch is one of the most powerful levers on Earth. How does a canal shift the balance of nations? In March 2021, a single ship named the Ever Given ran aground and did something almost unthinkable. It stopped 12% of global trade for 6 days. Think about that. One vessel, one stretch of water, and suddenly the world economy was holding its breath. That is the paradox of the Suez Canal, a narrow man-made waterway that controls the flow of everything, from oil to electronics, from grain to natural gas. It is a strategic asset so fragile that a single mistake can ripple across continents. And the question is, who really holds the power here? And to understand who holds that power, we have to go back to the moment this ditch was just an idea scratched in the sand. The Suez Canal was not some ancient waterway like the Nile. It was a 19th-century bet, a massive engineering gamble that redrew the map of global trade. Before it existed, if you wanted to move goods from London to Mumbai, you had to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. That was a voyage of about 11,000 nautical miles. It took months. It was dangerous. It was expensive. Then came the canal. When it opened in 1869, that same journey dropped to just over 6,000 nautical miles, almost half the distance. You can't overstate what that meant. Suddenly, a European merchant could get spices from India, tea from China, silk from Japan, in weeks instead of months. The whole calculus of empire shifted. And the man who pushed this through was a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps. He had already built the Suez Canal Company with the support of the Egyptian ruler, Khedive Ismail. It was a French and Egyptian project, financed by European investors, built by tens of thousands of forced laborers. The human cost was staggering. Estimates say over 100,000 workers lost their lives during construction. But from a strategic standpoint, the canal was a triumph. Now here's the thing. The canal did not just shorten shipping routes. It created a new kind of geopolitical chessboard. Britain, the dominant naval power of the era, watched this French-built canal with deep suspicion. The British had already controlled the Cape route. They had bases at the Cape of Good Hope, at Gibraltar, at Malta. But Suez was a French lever, and that made it a threat. So Britain did what empires do. It moved to take control. In 1875, the British government quietly bought Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company. But it was enough to put a foot in the door. Then, in 1882, after a nationalist uprising in Egypt, the British invaded and occupied the country. They claimed it was temporary. It lasted 70 years. And this is where the canal's strategic logic gets really interesting. Because once Britain controlled Egypt, it controlled the canal. And once it controlled the canal, it could choke off the lifeblood of any rival. Think about it this way. In the age of steam, coal was everything. British warships and merchant vessels needed coaling stations along every major route. Suez became the linchpin of that network. A British admiral could move the Royal Navy from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean in a matter of days. That was a decisive advantage. It meant that Britain could project power into Asia faster than any other European power. The canal was not just a shortcut, it was a weapon. It turned the British Empire into a truly global force, with the ability to reinforce India, to threaten Russia and Central Asia, to dominate trade with China. So let me break this down. The Suez Canal in the late 19th century was more than a piece of infrastructure. It was a strategic asset that redrew the balance of power. France built it, but Britain took it. And that seizure reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East and beyond. The canal became the jugular of the British Empire. And that is the first piece of the puzzle. Because the story of Suez is the story of who controls the choke points. And in the decades that followed, that question would only grow more urgent. But here's where the story pivots in a way that still echoes today. For decades, Britain held the canal tight. But by the 1950s, the world had changed. The British Empire was crumbling. and a charismatic Egyptian leader named Gamal Abdel Nasser had a different vision. He wanted to reclaim Egypt's sovereignty, and he saw the canal as the key. In July 1956, Nasser did something that shocked the Western powers. He nationalized the Suez Canal Company. He took control of the waterway outright, and he did it right in the middle of a Cold War chess match. Now think about what that meant. The canal was not just a piece of infrastructure anymore. It was a symbol. For Egypt, it was a declaration of independence from colonial domination. For Britain and France, it was a direct threat to their economic and strategic interests. Britain still relied on the canal for oil shipments from the Persian Gulf. France saw Nasser as a destabilizing force in North Africa, especially with his support for the Algerian independence movement. And Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors, viewed the canal as a potential choke point that could be used against them. So the three powers cooked up a plan. In October 1956, Israel invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Then, as prearranged, Britain and France issued an ultimatum. They demanded both sides withdraw from the canal zone. When Egypt refused, British and French forces bombed Egyptian airfields and landed troops along the canal. On paper, it looked like a classic imperial intervention. The British and French had the military muscle. They had the element of surprise. They quickly seized control of the canal. But here's the thing. They hadn't counted on the reaction from Washington and Moscow. And this is where the Suez Crisis becomes a masterclass in how the Cold War reshaped the rules of the game. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious. Eisenhower saw the invasion as a reckless act of old-school colonialism that would push Arab nations straight into the Soviet camp. He did not want to alienate the newly independent states of Asia and Africa. So the US did something unprecedented. It used economic pressure against its own allies. Eisenhower threatened to sell off US holdings of British bonds, which would have crashed the pound sterling, and he refused to provide emergency oil shipments to Britain. Within days, the British economy was teetering. The invasion collapsed. British and French forces withdrew. The canal stayed in Egyptian hands. And the Soviet Union? Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. He threatened to rain rockets down on London and Paris if the invasion did not stop. Whether that threat was real or bluster is debated. But the message was clear. The superpowers now called the shots. The Suez Crisis marked the moment when Britain and France lost their status as global powers. From then on, the canal's fate would be decided in Washington and Moscow, not London or Paris. It was a turning point. The canal had shifted from a tool of European empire to a pawn in the Cold War. Now fast forward to today. The canal operates quietly for the most part. It is run by the Suez Canal Authority, an Egyptian state entity. About 12% of global trade passes through it every year. And the politics are different. No more invasions. No more ultimatums. But the underlying reality has not changed. The canal is still a strategic asset that can be used as leverage. Egypt controls it, but the world depends on it. And that dependence creates a constant tension, because the canal is not just a shipping lane. It is a reminder that geography still matters, that a narrow strip of water can still make or break economies, and that whoever holds the choke point holds a piece of the global balance of power. So what does this history mean for the world we live in right now? Think about the Panama Canal for a second. When it opened in 1914, it cut shipping times between the Atlantic and Pacific by weeks. But here's the catch. The United States didn't just build it for trade. They built it because a two-ocean navy needed a way to move ships fast without sailing around South America. That's geography dictating military strategy, and it reshaped global power for a century. Now here's a number that might surprise you. According to a 2023 study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, roughly 90% of the world's trade moves by sea, and about 60% of that passes through just a handful of choke points. Places like the Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Strait, the Suez Canal. One disruption in any of these spots, and the global economy starts to ripple. In 2021, when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days, it cost an estimated $9 billion in trade per day. That's not a theory. That's a real-world example of geography reaching into your wallet. And this is where it gets counterintuitive. Most people think technology has made geography irrelevant, We have satellites, drones, fiber optic cables that span oceans. But look closer. The cables themselves run through the same narrow corridors that ships do. The data centers that power the internet are clustered in specific geographic zones, near cheap energy, cool climates, stable governments. So geography did not disappear, it just shifted from the surface to the seabed and the server farm. Why does this matter for you? Because the next conflict won't just be fought with tanks and planes. It will be fought over undersea cables, rare earth mineral deposits in the South China Sea, and control of Arctic shipping lanes as the ice melts. If you want to understand how geography shapes power, subscribe to ABIS Media for more deep dives into the strategic landscape. Now let's zoom out from the historical drama and look at what the Suez Canal actually moves through its waters today, because the numbers are staggering. In 2022, the Suez Canal Authority reported that nearly 24,000 ships passed through the canal, carrying over 1.4 billion tons of cargo. That's roughly 12% of all global trade and about 30% of the world's container traffic. To put that in perspective, every single day, goods worth about $9 billion flow through that narrow ditch, and the canal earns Egypt around $7 billion in annual revenue. That's not pocket change. That's roughly 2% of Egypt's entire GDP. For a country as over 100 million people, that canal is a lifeline. But here's what most people miss. The canal is not just a general-purpose trade route. It's specifically critical for energy. Roughly 7 to 10% of the world's oil passes through the Suez Canal, mostly from the Persian Gulf, heading to Europe. And even more importantly, about 8% of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG, transits the canal. Qatar, one of the largest LNG exporters on the planet, ships most of its gas through Suez to reach European markets. That is why when the Ever Given blocked the canal in 2021, energy prices spiked almost immediately. Europe felt it, Asia felt it. The whole system is that tightly coupled. And this is where the canal's vulnerability becomes a strategic lever. Because Egypt knows the world needs this route. So in 2015, the Egyptian government launched a major expansion project. They deepened the canal in several sections and added a 35-kilometer second lane, allowing ships to pass in both directions simultaneously. The goal was to increase capacity and reduce waiting times. And it worked. Transit times dropped from about 18 hours to 11. But here is the catch. The expansion cost over $8 billion, and the revenue gains have been modest. In fact, some analysts argue the expansion was more about political messaging than pure economics. It was Egypt saying, "We own this canal, we control it, and we are investing in it." That is a statement of sovereignty. But the canal faces real competition now. The most talked about alternative is the Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's Arctic coast. As Arctic ice melts due to climate change, that route becomes more navigable. A ship traveling from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Northern Sea Route could cut the journey by about 10 days compared to going through Suez. That is a huge time savings. And Russia is aggressively developing that route, building icebreakers, ports, and infrastructure. In 2021, cargo traffic on the Northern Sea Route hit about 34 million tons. That is still tiny compared to Suez's 1.4 billion tons, but the trend is upward. And if the Arctic continues to warm, that route could siphon away a meaningful share of Suez traffic within a few decades. Then there is the competition from rail. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured billions into building rail corridors across Central Asia. A train from Chongqing to Duisburg, Germany, can make the trip in about 15 days. That is faster than sea freight through Suez, which takes around 30 days. The catch? Rail is much more expensive per container. So for high-value goods like electronics or pharmaceuticals, rail makes sense. For bulk commodities like grain or oil, sea routes still win. But the point is, the Suez Canal no longer has a monopoly on the Eurasia trade corridor. It faces competition from the north, from the east, and from the rails. And yet, the canal remains indispensable. Because it's not just about speed or cost, it's about scale. A single container ship can carry over 20,000 TEUs. 20-foot equivalent units. That is the equivalent of about 200 trains. No rail network on Earth can match that throughput. So for the foreseeable future, the Suez Canal will continue to be the backbone of global trade. But its strategic value is not static. It shifts with every new infrastructure project, every geopolitical realignment, every degree of Arctic warming. So here is the takeaway. The canal is a bottleneck, but it is a bottleneck with alternatives, and that changes the power dynamic. Egypt cannot take its control for granted, because if the canal becomes too expensive, too unreliable, or too politicized, the world will find other ways to move goods. That is the quiet pressure that every choke point holder faces. You have leverage, but only as long as you do not abuse it. And that is a delicate balance. And the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea since late 2023 have shown just how fragile this entire system really is. The Houthis, backed by Iran and based in Yemen, control the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, that narrow passage at the southern entrance to the Red Sea that every ship heading to or from the Suez Canal must pass through. In late 2023, they started targeting commercial vessels they believed were linked to Israel. They used drones and missiles. Within weeks, the world's largest shipping companies, Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transit through the Red Sea. So ships started going the long way around the Cape of Good Hope. That added about 10 days to each journey. Fuel costs skyrocketed. Insurance premiums for ships still willing to transit the Red Sea jumped by 500% or more. By early 2024, container shipping rates from Asia to Europe had tripled. Some routes quadrupled. And this is the part that should make you sit up. The Houthis do not have a navy, they do not have aircraft carriers, but they had cheap drones and missiles, and they used them to shut down one of the world's most critical trade corridors. That is the asymmetry of modern geopolitics. A non-state actor with limited resources can disrupt the global supply chain in a way that even a major power would struggle to match. Here's the irony. The Suez Canal itself remained open. Egypt did not close it. The canal was not damaged. But it did not matter. The approach routes were too dangerous. So ships simply stopped coming. In the first quarter of 2024, canal toll revenues dropped by roughly 40 to 50%. That is billions of dollars in lost income for a country that desperately needs every dollar it can get. And this is where the political balancing act gets brutal. Egypt has to manage its relationship with Israel. The two countries signed a peace treaty in 1979, and that treaty is the foundation of Egypt's security relationship with the United States. Egypt gets about $1.3 billion in US military aid every year because of that treaty. So Egypt cannot afford to openly side with the Houthis or Iran. At the same time, Egypt has deep ties to the Arab world and cannot be seen as helping Israel either. So it condemns the Houthi attacks publicly, but does not commit military forces to the US-led coalition. It keeps the canal open, but watches its revenues evaporate. And the Houthis? They know exactly what they are doing. They are not trying to sink every ship. They are creating uncertainty. And uncertainty is more damaging than actual destruction. Because when shipping companies cannot predict whether a route is safe, they default to the longer, more expensive option. That is a strategic victory. They have demonstrated that they can reach global trade without leaving Yemen. Every other non-state actor in the region is paying close attention. Now bring this back to the Ever Given. That grounding in 2021 was an accident. A gust of wind, a moment of poor judgment, and the canal was blocked. But the Houthi attacks are intentional, a deliberate use of geography as a weapon. And that changes the calculation. Because if a single accident can cause $9 billion in daily losses, imagine what sustained disruption does. In the first 6 months of the Red Sea crisis, the total cost to global trade was estimated at over $100 billion. That is not a blip. That is a structural shift. And here is the part that keeps strategists up at night. The Bab el-Mandeb is not the only choke point vulnerable to this kind of pressure. The Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes, is controlled by Iran. The Malacca Strait sits between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and is within range of Chinese naval bases. The Panama Canal is facing drought restrictions. Every major choke point has a vulnerability. And the Suez Canal is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. So where does that leave Egypt? It leaves the country in a position of immense leverage, but also immense risk. Egypt cannot control what happens in Yemen. It cannot control Iranian ambitions. It cannot control the weather or the Arctic ice. But it can control the canal itself. And that means it has to keep the canal running efficiently, keep tolls competitive, and keep its diplomatic relationships balanced. One wrong move, one decision to raise tolls too high, one alignment with the wrong side, and the world's shipping companies will find alternatives. The Northern Sea Route, the Cape of Good Hope, the Trans-Siberian Railway, they are all waiting. And that is the real lesson of the Suez Canal in the 21st century. It is not just a ditch in the sand. It is a mirror reflecting the entire geopolitical landscape. Every shift in power, every new technology, every conflict, it all shows up in the canal's traffic numbers. The canal is a barometer of global stability, and right now, that barometer is flashing red. So the Suez Canal is not just a ditch in the sand. It is a mirror. It reflects the ambitions of empires, the desperation of economies, and the fragility of the global system we have built. Every time a ship passes through, it carries more than cargo. It carries the weight of history, the tension of geopolitics, and the quiet reminder that geography still dictates the terms of power, even in this digital age. The canal's influence is not really about the ships at all. It is about who controls the choke points. And that is the question we started with. What makes a canal a strategic asset that influences global power dynamics? The answer is simple. It is not the water, it is the leverage. For more on the hidden geography of power, subscribe to ABIS Media.